Hampton Court Palace, silk, gold, the sound of the lute at endless feasts, and over it all, one dissonant element, an unbearable smell, the smell of rotting meat. Courtiers with forced smiles try to ignore it, but it permeates the tapestries, the food, their very clothes. The source of this stench, the enormous bloated body of King Henry VIII. According to contemporary accounts, the fever from the ulcers on his legs was so strong that it could be smelled 3 rooms away before the monarch even appeared. The entire palace was like an exquisite jewelry box with a corpse slowly decaying inside. This is the story of how the most brilliant prince in Europe turned into a rotting monster. And we will show you the very day it all went wrong. It all began with a single wound. But this is not just a story about a disease, it is an investigation. We will answer the question, how does a man's physical decay mirror his moral and political collapse? His body is a crime scene, and the unhealing ulcers are the clues that lead to the secret of his tyranny. Modern research confirms that chronic pain is directly linked to uncontrolled aggression and paranoia. Henry's body became a dark mirror, reflecting the diseased state of the entire kingdom. We will trace this connection from the first drop of pus to the final swing of the executioner's axe. What was this wound that never healed? How did the courtiers manage to survive next to a walking source of infection? And what was the gruesome incident with his coffin that terrified all of England? Years earlier, a friar named William Peto had predicted to Henry's face, "Dogs will lick thy blood." The ghastly event with the coffin became a literal fulfillment of the prophecy, transforming the story from grotesque to almost supernatural. The answers lie ahead. Stop. Before we continue, you must see him, not the monster, but the athlete, a handsome man, a champion of jousting tournaments, a composer, and a poet. Standing nearly 6 feet 3 inches tall, he was a giant for his time. He wrote music that is still performed today, and the ultimate paradox, the Pope awarded him the title Defender of the Faith for a book he wrote against Martin Luther. It is a title British monarchs hold to this day. This man was a Renaissance ideal. Remember this image, because now we are going to destroy it. January 24th, 1536, Greenwich. Henry is 44 and still a champion, but on this day his horse, clad in steel armor, falls, and it crushes him. This was not just an accident. It was the 16th century equivalent of a car crash. The combined weight of the horse and 2 sets of armor, his and the animal's, exceeded a ton. The king is unconscious for 2 hours. The entire court believes he is dead. The news reaches Queen Anne Boleyn. The shock causes her to miscarry. She loses a boy, the heir for whom Henry had torn Christendom apart. For her, this loss was a death sentence, and for him, it was the beginning of the end. He survived, but an old wound on his leg reopened, this time for good. Modern medicine offers a diagnosis: chronic osteomyelitis, an infection that literally eats away at the bone. In the 16th century, this was a death sentence drawn out over years of agony. His leg turned into an open, suppurating ulcer. His doctors did the only thing they knew how. They periodically cauterized it with a red-hot iron. It was like trying to extinguish a forest fire with a flamethrower. The procedure created a crust of burned flesh on the surface, but only drove the infection deeper, allowing it to devour the bone from within, unimpeded. Imagine a pain that never stops, ever. Not by day, not by night. A throbbing, searing pain that became the backdrop to his entire life. Pain became his shadow advisor, an invisible courtier, whispering the most venomous advice into his ear around the clock. And unlike all his other advisors, this was one he could not execute. Henry lived with this for 11 years. Chroniclers note a sharp change in his character specifically after 1536. The charming monarch disappears. In his place emerges a quick-tempered, suspicious tyrant. The Holy Roman Emperor's ambassador, Eustace Chapuys, wrote that the king had become distrustful and so ill-tempered that it is scarcely possible to speak to him. This is not a historian's guess. It is a documented fact. Paine became his chief political consultant, and it advised only one thing: rage. But the wound was merely the trigger. It was the first domino that, in falling, set off a chain reaction that brought down his entire physiology. His body became a biological prison, and the first of its walls was his weight. Deprived of movement, he began to consume the world around him. His diet consisted of fatty red meat, sweet wines, and strong ale. Historians have calculated his daily calorie intake at over 5,000. That is the equivalent of more than 10 modern Big Macs, every single day. His suits of armor, displayed in the Tower of London, silently tell this story. They show how his athlete's waist swelled to 55 inches. But the weight was only the visible part of the decay. The real hell was the varicose ulcers on both legs. They constantly oozed pus and blood, emitting that very smell. The doctors tried to help. They inserted lead tubes into the open wounds to drain the pus, which only intensified the pain and introduced new infections. And here is a chilling modern hypothesis: they were slowly poisoning him. Lead is toxic. Entering the bloodstream, it causes confusion, fits of rage, and memory loss. The cure was part of the disease. Soon, Henry could no longer walk. He moved about in a chair. To lift him to the second floor or seat him on a horse, servants used a complex system of pulleys and winches. He was hoisted with the same mechanisms used to load cargo onto ships. The most powerful man in England had become helpless cargo, moved about like a barrel of ale. Now, look at this through the eyes of a servant. You are ordered to wash and dress these ulcers. You feel nausea, fear, but your face must show only concern. One movement that is too sudden, one grimace of pain on the king's face, and you could be sent to the block. Tending to Henry's leg was one of the most dangerous jobs in England. It was like being a bomb disposal expert. One wrong touch could trigger an explosion of royal anger. And that explosion was fatal. And this prison of flesh inevitably built a prison for the mind. When you cannot trust your own body, you stop trusting anyone else. His kingdom became a precise projection of his diseased organism. He tried to cauterize dissent with executions, just as the doctors cauterized his rotting leg. His paranoia began to consume England from within, just as the infection was consuming his bone. The formula for his decay was terrifyingly simple. Constant pain breeds insomnia. Insomnia exhausts the nervous system, and exhaustion leads to irrational rage and total distrust. Henry's mind became a courtroom where pain was the eternal prosecutor, and sleep was the defense witness who never appeared. In this court, all the king's subjects were guilty by default. His decrees were no longer dictated by the logic of the state. They were simply sentences handed down in a fit of agony. Just compare the dates. 1536, the injury. In that same year, Anne Boleyn is executed on fabricated charges. 1540, the condition of his legs deteriorates sharply. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, is executed. 1542, the bouts of pain become unbearable. His fifth wife, Catherine Howard, is executed. These are not coincidences. This is the bloody timetable of his illness. Cromwell's execution is particularly telling. He had arranged Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves. Henry, already tormented by his body, was horrified by her appearance, calling her the Flanders mare. The humiliation, layered on top of his physical pain, became Cromwell's death sentence. Henry's pain demanded sacrifices. Deprived of the ability to dominate physically, he began to dominate through absolute terror. Henry expanded the definition of treason to absurd lengths. Now, even predicting the king's death was punishable by death. His cruelty became inventive. When a cook named Richard Rose was accused of an assassination attempt by poison, Henry did not send him to the block. He devised a special execution for him. The cook was boiled alive in a cauldron of water. The weaker the king became, the more monstrous his tyranny grew. Imagine Henry's trust scale. Before the injury, it might have hovered around a 5 out of 10. After 1536, it plummeted to 0. And it never rose again. He introduced a system of dry stamps to sign decrees, entrusting them to only 3 courtiers. But this bred a new wave of paranoia. What if they used the stamp without his knowledge? He trusted no one, not his doctors, not his wives, not his counselors. The entire court saw this decay. They could smell it. But everyone was forced to participate in a grand farce, pretending their king was still all-powerful. Even the court jester, Will Somers, one of the few who was allowed to speak the truth, grew cautious in the final years. His jokes lost their edge. When even the jester is afraid to jest, it is a sign of absolute tyranny. The system of total silence worked flawlessly. In this theater of the absurd, everyone knew their part. Courtiers learned to calculate the wind direction to stand on the king's leeward side. They applauded his hoarse speeches, pretending not to notice the grimaces of pain on his face. They marveled at his appetite as he turned into an immobile mountain of flesh. To be a courtier of Henry VIII was like acting in a play without a script, where the lead actor is armed with a real axe and might start an execution at any moment. And the leading lady in this deadly drama was his last wife, Catherine Parr. In essence, she was his nurse. She personally changed the dressings on his suppurating ulcers, risking not only infection but also provoking a burst of rage from a single clumsy touch. She once nearly ended up on the scaffold over a careless argument about religion. But Catherine was not merely a victim. She was one of the most intelligent women of her time. A writer and a reformer, she waged her own intellectual war. She was a dragon tamer. She treated his wounds, but never for a second forgot that he could incinerate her with a single word. His infirmity paradoxically became his greatest weapon. The very sight of his decaying body, its smell, all of it was a constant reminder of his agony, and therefore, of his anger. No one wanted to upset a man who was already living in hell. He used this with cold calculation. During audiences, he would sometimes deliberately display his bandaged leg for all to see. It was a brilliant form of nonverbal blackmail. He simultaneously evoked pity and paralyzing terror. His illness held the entire court hostage, but no pretense could stop biology. In January 1547, the king's body began its final rebellion, and here the court faced the last and most absurd of Henry's laws. The Treason Act forbade predicting the monarch's death. The doctors looked at each other in terror. To tell the king the truth meant signing their own death warrant. Archbishop Cranmer had to be summoned. He did not say Henry was dying. He asked if he believed in salvation through Jesus Christ, to let the king understand the end was near. Henry died, but his body had not yet finished its story. What happened next surpassed the most gruesome fantasies. In his final days, he no longer spoke. He communicated with gestures. He signed death warrants not with a pen, but with a special dry stamp that simply imprinted his signature. The last person he sentenced to death was the Duke of Norfolk, one of his oldest companions. The execution was scheduled for the morning of January 28th. Henry died during the night before. Norfolk survived. The king's will to violence had literally outlived him. His last words were rumored to be, "Monks, monks, monks." Modern medicine suggests a diagnosis, a pulmonary embolism. A blood clot dislodged from his diseased leg traveled to his lungs and killed him. The very wound from 1536 had delivered the final fatal blow. His enormous body was embalmed and placed in a massive lead-lined coffin. It was so heavy that a special hearse, drawn by 8 horses, was built for it. It was a major engineering operation. During the journey to Windsor, the procession stopped for the night in a chapel. And there, due to the pressure of decomposition gases, the coffin exploded. The lead seams burst. Bodily fluids leaked onto the stone floor. Chroniclers claim that the next morning, dogs ran into the chapel and began to lick the king's remains from the floor. The prophecy of the friar William Peto, "Dogs will lick thy blood," had been fulfilled, literally. His tyranny, his decay, it all burst forth, defiling the world even after his death. He was buried in Windsor Castle, next to Jane Seymour, his third wife, the only one who gave him an heir, and the only one he seems to have truly loved. This island of tenderness, in an ocean of cruelty and grotesquerie, became the most poignant paradox of his life. Henry's story is not a historical anecdote. It is a universal protocol for the disintegration of a personality. First, a single point of pain is found, which becomes the center of one's existence. Second, the pain mutates into fear and paranoia. And third, the person begins to project their internal enemy onto the world around them. They destroy others because they cannot defeat the enemy that is devouring them from within. This is the source code of tyranny. A physical trauma, is a bug in the system that causes a cascading failure, corrupting the entire personality code and turning a leader into a monster. And so, the great events of history, the English Reformation, the executions, the wars, turn out to be merely side effects of a festering wound. The dissolution of the monasteries brought the crown colossal wealth. This money was his strongest painkiller, a distraction from his physical suffering. Perhaps the history of England was written not in ink, but in blood and pain. And in the end, we are left with the ultimate question. What defined his reign and the fate of England more? His unbending royal will, or his uncontrollably rotting body? Modern science, such as psychoneuroimmunology, tells us this is a false choice. The will and the body are inseparable. They were locked in a deadly feedback loop. The pain intensified the tyranny, and the tyranny created stress that worsened the pain. But still, which was stronger? His will or his body?